Hej, kära isländska bröder och systrar. Welcome to this video regarding the possible consequences of an EU membership. My name is Ulf Ström. I'm a Swedish sea captain, but also active in the Swedish People's Movement No to EU, and where I also serve as chairman of the Swexit party here in Sweden. In this video, I would like to share with you some of Sweden's experiences from more than 30 years of membership in the European Union, i.e. the realities we faced after the Swedish referendum in 1994. What we voted for was increased trade and increased influence in Europe, i.e. to be able to sit around the table and participate in the decision making instead of standing on the side as a spectator only. What we got was an invisible influence and a shrinking trade, from 62% of our export to EU in 1994, the year before we joined the EU, to 51% to EU today. We are some 10 million people in Sweden, which gives us 21 out of 720 seats in the EU Parliament, which corresponds to 2.9% of the votes. In practice, it means that we have 2.9% influence over how, for instance, French farmers grow their olives. But it also means the reverse, that the EU has roughly 97% influence over how, for instance, Swedish farmers milk their cows. In reality, it's even worse, because those 21 seats, they are spread over 8 different political parties. Parties pulling in different directions on different issues, and sometimes even against one another. Our largest Swedish party is the Social Democrats. They have 5 seats down there, which corresponds to 0.7%. Which brings us to the first quiz question of this video. How much influence do you get with 0.7% of the votes? Now, let's compare that with the Icelandic conditions. If you were about to join EU, you would most likely get 6 seats in the European Parliament, the minimum allocation for any member state as it stands for now, giving you 0.8% influence, but which also then means that EU gets 99.2% influence over how, for instance, your fishing fleets catch your fish. I will come back to that later on. When I'm asked about how the decision-making machinery works in Brussels, I usually describe it as a housing association. A husfälla, which I have named Husfälla Sultukrotka, with 27 members. In the upper flats live the North Europeans, and in the lower flats live the South Europeans. And this association works exactly as any housing association out there, but with one exception. In this association, it's the board which have the decision power over the members and not the other way around, which is the usual style. Anyhow, one day when you are sitting in your flat, the doorbell rings. You open the entrance door and see the entire association board standing out in the stairwell with serious expressions on their faces. And they tell you that they have a problem with the members living in the lower flats. We are talking about our Italian neighbors, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Greeks. They have partied up all their money so that they are unable to pay the monthly membership fee. So we in the board, we have now decided that it's now going to be paid by you instead. Yep. And by the way, While you are doing that, please make sure that you also provide them with a fully charged credit card so that they will be able to continue the party down there. And this was more or less exactly what happened in 2004 when the Eastern countries joined EU, and EU changed the shape from a trading union to a transfer union. This meant in practice that our countries up here in the north became contributors to the since many years mismanaged countries in the east and in the south, but in such a smart way that all countries, even we in Sweden, became receivers of contributions. We became contributors to ourselves, so to say. The way it works is that for every Swedish crown we today receive in contribution from EU, we have already paid 3 crowns to the EU in advance, i.e. we only get a third back. Sweden pays correspondingly 650 billion Icelandic crowns in a membership fee per year to EU and get approximately 200 billion Icelandic crowns back in contributions. And it's reasonable to believe that Iceland would face the same conditions. But now you might ask, if we pay 3 crowns but only get 1 back, what happens to those 2 crowns which appears to disappear in the meantime? Well, it's those 2 crowns which are distributed as contributions to the mismanaged economies in the southern and eastern part of Europe. And 2 countries which are interesting to compare with is Greece and Hungary. 2 countries which also have 10 million inhabitants each. For every crown they pay in a membership fee, they get 3 back in contribution. So that is the way it works. I'm sure you get the maths here. The largest spending item in the EU budget is agricultural and regional subsidies. 38% of the entire EU budget is distributed as grants, largely to unprofitable agricultural sectors, particularly in southern and eastern Europe. This has, in turn, undermined the Swedish agricultural industry. As a result, 35,000 farms have disappeared since Sweden joined the European Union. 9 out of every 10 farms have vanished. That in turn has affected our ability to feed ourselves. If Sweden's borders were closed today, this country would have food supplies for only 10 days. But that's not all. Over the years, we have been subjected to an endless stream of regulations which have harmed Sweden. Working time regulations that have led emergency personnel across the country to resign from their jobs. Skyrocketing electricity prices caused by the fourth energy package, which requires Sweden to make 70% of its electricity transmission capacity available to the rest of Europe. Which means that we are forced to pay German prices for originally very cheap and green electricity. It has now gone so far that regulations determine who is allowed to service a heating boiler, and even what type of surface should be used on a football pitch. From being one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, we now have the lowest growth rate in the EU. Despite being one of the largest net contributors per capita, we are among those who have the least influence. From having control of our borders and being among the safest countries in Europe, we now suffer from some of the highest levels of crime. And in order to understand how the future might look like for Sweden, let's return to the housing cooperative. Time passes, and then there is another knock on the door. The board is standing outside, and they explain that a pandemic has struck. Everyone's finances are under severe pressure, including the members of our housing cooperative and the families living in the apartments downstairs, who have continued celebrating as if nothing had happened, have once again maxed out of the credit card that you previously topped up for them. It needs to be refilled. And not by a little, because if it's not, they risk bankruptcy. And that is precisely how the European Union was transformed from a transfer union into a debt union. In 2020, Sweden was forced to agree that the European Commission should be allowed to borrow money on behalf of the member states. Today, that common debt already exceeds 100,000 billion Icelandic kroner. Several EU member states are on the brink of financial collapse. The number of recipient countries continues to grow. And more of them are demanding additional financial support in order to avoid bankruptcy. The recent Draghi report called for the equivalent of another 100,000 billion Icelandic kroner per year in support for European industry in order to maintain competitiveness. Ukraine and several other countries are waiting in line to join the European Union. Their accession could require another 100,000 billion Icelandic kroner to bring them up to EU standards. Europe is also rearming militarily. That too will require tens of thousands of billions of Icelandic kroner. These are debts that one day will have to be repaid. And if the countries benefiting from these loans are unable to honor their obligations, who do you think will ultimately be asked to pay the bill? Well, the answer is simple. The remaining net contributor countries in Northern Europe. And over time, that burden could become financially devastating for all of us. My dear Icelandic friends, when I think of Iceland, I think of North Atlantic, I think of resilience, I think of a people who have always found their own way. Your ancestors crossed dangerous seas. They built communities in a harsh landscape. They preserved their language, their culture, and their independence through centuries of change. That history deserves respect. So, good luck with the 29th of August, and many thanks for listening so far. See you later.